I'm going to do my absolute best to say this as honestly and accurately as I know it, but I might get something wrong because part of the way that the estate tax has been reduced over time is by making it so incredibly complicated that families are able to get around via loopholes. So there is a reason why estate planning is such a is a booming field because of.
But again, why should it be such a booming field when most people aren't ever going to hit these thresholds?
No, most people aren't going to hit these thresholds, but they're trying to. But because of the way that the estate tax has put such a tax cut on death, yeah, I mean the easiest.
They're just trying to maximize that.
They're trying to maximize. The federal government is trying to tax wealth. They do a very bad job at it, and wealthy people do a very good job at avoiding it. And in some ways, the estate tax is like the extreme case, not necessarily the median case.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
So let's go back.
Let's go back in time.
Way, way back. This is to help explain what the estate tax is and to also make sure that none of you are left with a notion that this is some type of like modern liberal invention to tax wealthy people. So the first version of the estate, so you die with money.
Okay.
The first version of the tax.
Bags of gold.
You have burlap sacks with gold, with dollar signs on the side that is filled with gold coins. In 1797, in order to raise money from for the Navy, because the U.S. is worried about how we don't need to get into the relationship with France at the time, but it's definitely a part of it. So actually, this is all France's fault. But the first version of a tax on assets at death is a stamp tax, and it's kind of like almost like a title fee that we have today. That in order for the piece of paper to say this property, which belonged to this person who died, is now going to this person, you had to pay a flat fee for like the literal stamp that went on it to say, yes, in fact, this property is now transferred. And so you can think of it as like a flat per cap fee that in order to transfer property, including at death, you had to pay for the stamp, the seal of officialdom to make it recorded in law. And yeah, that was later repealed when we didn't need to raise as much money for the Navy. But the first version was a fee. The second,
and that was for any kind of property, or specifically real estate property, or bank accounts. Never mind, doesn't matter. Keep going.
I think it was just land. But maybe businesses. The second kind of version of this, you die and you own assets and the state is going to collect money from it, came in 1862 with the Revenue Act. This was, again, to raise money for a war, this time the Civil War. And this one was closer to an inheritance tax, which is you basically tax all the people who inherit the money. So if I die with $1 million and it goes to one kid versus if I die with $1 million and it goes to 15 kids, the inheritance tax is levied on the receiver. So you have enough of them, you basically lower below the threshold, or if one of the kids doesn't make that much money, it's really a function of the person who's being taxed is the receiver, and it's a tax on inherited income and wealth. We had that during the Civil War. It was later repealed. And then we had a version. So that, which is to say that an inheritance tax is not the same as the estate tax. The inheritance tax taxes the person, the kid who's getting the money. The estate tax taxes the property in totality as one of, this is the total amount of property. No matter how many people are going to inherit it, it's going to be taxed as a complete unit. So we had a version of this estate tax during the Spanish-American War in 1898. And then once the war ended, we repealed it a few years later. But what's interesting,
it's always a war tax.
I mean, that's when we really needed taxes.
Yeah.
We needed extra money. And so the estate tax, the inheritance tax, the stamp tax, they were all ways to raise revenue for war. But in the early 1900s, in the Progressive era, income taxes and estate taxes were championed by Teddy Roosevelt in order to counter the gross wealth inequality and income inequality that was coming out of the Gilded Age. And so it's fascinating that the estate tax has this history of being, we need to raise some money pretty quickly. But it shifts as you get to the 20th century, where it becomes a corrective measure of like, these people have too much money, and it's going to ruin our country that we have these mergers and accumulation of, what we would call monopolies, what they would call trust. And the wealth is held in one person. That person wields undue influence and power in our democracy. We need to break up that wealth. So we'll do it when they die. And the income tax was part of that. So Teddy Roosevelt was successful in this effort, even though it did not occur during his administration. The 16th Amendment, which creates federal authority for an income tax, is passed in 1909, which is basically his last week. His presidency ends. He does not run for re-election in 1908. So it passes right at the end of at the start of the next administration, and it's ratified a few years later in 1913. And in 1913, we passed the first federal income tax. And in 1916, weirdly enough, motivated in part by World War I, we passed the estate tax.
Mm-hmm.
And so this idea that we're raising money for acute needs, and the extra pool of money needs to come from the very wealthy, as well as let's break up these big dynasties, it was all there, in the first 10 years of the 20th century.